Om Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanao Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shante Shante Shanti. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kuru Me Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada. Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada. Samasta Jana Kalyane Niratam Karunamayam Namami Chinmayam Devam Satgurum Brahma Vidvaram Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yat Kripatamaham Vande Paramananda Madhavam. We will chant Gita Dhyana. I'll share my screen so that you are able to see. Please make sure you have your copies out. Om Parthaya Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Kratitam Puranam Nina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitamritavarshini Bhagavati Ashtadashadhyayini Amba Tvamanusandadhami Bhagavad Gite Bhavatveshini Namostute Vyasa Vishala Buddhe Pullarvindayata Patra Netra Yena Tvaya Bharata Taila Purnaha Prajvalito Jnanamaya Pradipaha Prapanna Parijataya Totra Vetraikapanaye Jnanamudraya Krishnaya Gitamritaduhe Namaha Sarvopanishado Gavaha Tobdha Gopalanandanaha Partho Vatsasudhir Bhokta Tubdham Gitamritam Mahat Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsa Chanuramardhanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru Bhishma Drona Tata Jayadratha Gandhara Nilotpala Shalyagrahavati Kripena Vahani Karnena Velakula Ashvathama Vikarna Ghora Makara Duryodhana Vartini Sotirna Khalu Pandavairanadi Kaivartakah Keshavaha Parasharyavachas Sarojamamalam गीतार्थगन्धोत्कटं नानाख्यानककेसरं हरिकथा सम्बोधनाबोधितम् लोके सज्जनषट्पदैरहरः पेपीयमानं मुदा भूयात् भारतपङ्कजं कलिमल प्रध्वंसिन श्रेयसे मूकं करोति वाचालं पङ्गुं लङ्घयते गिरिं यत्कृपातमहं वन्दे परमानन्दमाधवम् यं ब्रह्मा वरुणेन्द्ररुद्रमरुतः स्तुन्वन्ति दिव्यैस्तवैः वेदैः साङ्कपतक्रमोपनिषदैः गायन्ति यं सामगाः ध्यानावस्थिततद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यं योगिनः यस्यान्तं न विदुःसुरासुरगणाः देवाय तस्मै नमः देवाय तस्मै नमः. Okay, great. So starting next week, in the beginning of class, we won't do Gita Dhyana. What we're going to start to do is we're going to start chanting the verses of the Bhagavad Gita actually. So by now, I'm hoping many of you have mastered Gita Dhyana. So for example, next week, we will chant from chapter 2, 10 verses, okay? 10 or so verses, just because these are very beautiful verses to keep in mind. When we get to the end of chapter 2, there will be one segment which I will ask all of us to memorize. We will keep chanting that again and again and again, okay? And that will be Sthita Prajna Lakshana, okay? All right. So now let us chant verse number 7. So if you turn to verse number 7, we will pick up from there. Karpanyadoshopahatah svabhavah pritchami tvam dharma samudhachetah yat shreyasya nishchitam bruhi tanme shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam. So we are in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna is a very beautiful student. He comes out as a very beautiful student. Why? Because he accepts that he has issues and he detects what those issues are. He says, Karpanya dosho pahata swabhava. My swabhava as a kshatriya, my nature, as though has been kidnapped. It has been kidnapped by this karpanya dosha, by this misery, by this sorrow that I'm feeling. So whatever my kshatriya duty is, I'm unable to perform it. I'm just overpowered by grief. And he says, dharma samudha chetaha. My mind is confused or deluded in dharma. It's not that I have not learned dharma. I have learned it, but for some reason, I'm just so deluded by it. I'm not able to perform it. And so here we see Muda here indicates moha. He's deluded. So there's moha. And karpanya dosha. The karpanya indicates shoka or grief. So here we can clearly see Arjuna is saying that I am suffering from delusion and I am suffering from grief. Because of this overwhelming grief, I cannot do my dharma. And he says further to Lord Krishna, Yat Shreya Syat, that which is Shreya, and we went through what Shreya was last week. Bruhi Tat Me, you tell me that which is Shreyas. And how Nishchita, tell me in a way that I really understand. Convince me about it. Tell me in a determined way. And he has changed the relationship. He says, Shishyaha te aham. I am now your student. Shadi Mam, please instruct me. So Shadi doesn't mean here marriage, but it comes from the root Shas, and Shas means to instruct. Shadi Mam Tvam Prapanna, I take refuge in you. So here we see the magical formula that Arjuna uses. ADS. He accepts that he has some kind of issues there. He's able to detect what those issues are, and he surrenders to Bhagavan Krishna. Now, when we think of surrender, many people think that surrender is a weak thing. Because when we have this notion of surrender, it is maybe a battle between two, and you're unable to perform, you're unable to win. So you just say, okay, I'm just going to surrender because I cannot win. Or, it's something like a deal between two people or a competition. And when the other person appears stronger and wiser, the weaker person says, okay, I'm going to lose anyway, so I might as well surrender. And so it makes us think it's something that's done out of weakness. It's something that's done because we're not able to face the situation. It's something that's done, that is looked down upon. But spiritual surrender is very different. It is not out of weakness, actually, but it comes from a place of strength. Why is that? Surrender is actually this emotion of understanding. It's this emotion of understanding what? Understanding that there is this universal being. Whatever you want to call this being, we call him God or her God. There's this universal being that is all-knowing, what we call Sarvagnya, knows everything. And Sarva Shakti, that which is all-powerful. So there's this being that is all-knowing and all-powerful. And right now, I may not know what to do. I may not know the whole picture. And I may be capable of doing some things, but if I want to grow, if I want to do more, then I need more strength and I need more wisdom. And this realization that I need more strength, I need more wisdom is not out of weakness. It's yes, things can happen, things can be conquered, but I cannot do it on my own. I cannot do it on my own because my knowledge, my strength, my being is limited. And therefore, I need more strength. I need more wisdom because I don't know. And to say that we don't know, to say that we have limited knowledge and limited power is actually a sign of the strong. To properly analyze the situation, to properly analyze ourselves is a sign of strong people. And to say, here is someone that knows, and therefore I surrender to this person. So surrender is out of strength. It is out of acknowledging that we are limited, but with God's help, we can be limitless. And therefore, surrender doesn't also mean that, whatever God's will, let it be done, and I don't have to do anything. Surrender doesn't mean that we don't do work. Surrender means that we are guided by something higher. We surrender and say, Bhagavan, you work through us. You do what you have to do through us. And that is how Arjuna surrendered to Bhagavan Krishna. It's not that he said, Lord Krishna, I surrender to you and you do all the work and I'm not going to do anything. No, his surrender is, I'm surrendering to you. You guide me. You guide me and I will do whatever you say because you know best. That is called surrender. So it's not we just sit down and let things happen. We are guided. And now we can see that Arjuna is guided by Lord Krishna very beautifully as the charioteer. And you are going to ask me, who do we have? And I think this question came up in one of our Q&As. who do we have? Who is our guide? When we become highly purified, highly sattvic, what happens is an external guru comes into our life. An external guru in the form of any person, could be any person, but comes into our life to guide us at the right point, at the right time. And when we become spiritually mature, that external guru now becomes that internal guru, which is nothing but the sattvic intellect, which is what we also call our antaryami. So don't feel like, oh, there's no Lord Krishna to guide us. There is. We just have to pay attention. And as I said, at the right point and right time, if we are pure, an external guru will come. But we have to be pure enough to also recognize that. Sometimes we also don't recognize it, right? And when we are ready, when we are mature, then that guru becomes our very own antaryami. So this is a very, very beautiful verse in the Bhagavad Gita that's worth contemplating on, because it brings up so many various facets of a student and teacher relationship and how one actually grows from surrender. I've put together a definition of surrender. I'm just going to share it with you, so then the meaning becomes a little bit clear, that it's not out of weakness. Okay, here we go. And I'll read it, and then, you can think about it a little bit more and reflect upon it after. So spiritual surrender means acknowledging that there is a higher power, which is an all-knowing, all-powerful being who knows what is best, and seeking guidance from that power to be an instrument of fulfilling that divine vision, so that one may evolve eventually to become one with that. That's called surrender. That's something Arjuna had. Now, we move on today to the next verse. So this is, Arjuna's Sharanagati, what we call, is verse number 7. And verse number 8 is a very nice realization that Arjuna has. So let's go to verse number 8. Right. So I will chant and then you can repeat. Nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat.
Nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat.
Yachokamuchoshanamindriyanam.
Yachokamuchoshanamindriyanam.
Avapya bhuma vasapatnamriddham.
Avapna bhumat vasapatnamriddham.
Rajyam suranamapi chadhipatyam.
Rajyam suranamapi chadhipatyam.
Nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat. Yachokamuchoshanamindriyanam. Avapya bhuma vasapatnamriddham. Rajyam suranamapi chadhipatyam. So what Arjuna says here is nahi prapashyami. He says nahi means he means certainly. Prapashyami means I really do not see. Nahi prapashyami mama apanudyat. That which can, apanudyat means that which can remove mama, my, yet shokam, this sorrow. I certainly do not see that this can remove my sorrow. What is this sorrow doing? Uchoshanam indriyanam. That sorrow which is uchoshanam. It is drying up my indriyas, my sense organs. This sorrow that is drying up my sense organs, I cannot see that it's being removed by this. By what? He said, avapya bhumau asapatnam riddham. He says, even if avapya means having obtained, bhumau means on earth, asapatnam, unrivaled, riddham, prosperous, rajyam, dominion. Having obtained this unrivaled, prosperous dominion over earth and adipatyam. Adipatyam means lordship, suranam, over the gods. Api, and even this lordship over the gods, I don't see that that's really going to take away my sorrow. So even if I rule this kingdom, let's say if we win and we rule this kingdom of Hastinapur and we have unrivaled, nobody is ever going to come to us because we're the most powerful ever. Let's say if we have that, let's say if we have great lordship, let's say if we have lordship over the gods, I just don't see my sorrow going by these so-called pleasures, these pleasures of the world, and even hereafter in the heavenly realm. I don't know if these pleasures can really take away my sorrow. And this is a great realization that Arjuna comes to. Why is that? Because most of us think that what gets rid of sorrow is joy. We think that these seeming pleasures of the world, which we term as joys, they get rid of sorrow. And Arjuna's here saying joy is not going to remove sorrow. We think when we get hurt, that to have someone by our side will give us joy, or to have someone call us, give us joy. Or when we lose someone, to have somebody constantly there with us, give us joy. We think that these things give us joy. They do give us temporary joy, but they cannot really remove the sorrow from the root. And Arjuna feels this, and he knows this. And in fact, that temporary joy which comes to reduce or alleviate our sorrow for the moment, if that joy stays too long, that joy becomes sorrow. Right? So imagine if you're there, if you're suffering and you have someone come and be with you and take care of you, after some time, you're like, okay, now when is this person going to go? Right? Or if you're missing your friends or your loved ones and you invite them to come to your house to meet you, and they spend so much time with you, and you're like, okay, now when are you going home? Isn't it late? Right? Or this. So whenever we think that joy can remove sorrow, it can temporarily. And even if that joy stays too long, it will cause sorrow only. So Arjuna realizes this in this verse. He says, what's really going to remove my sorrow is you, Lord Krishna. He's not asking for knowledge of the self or highest knowledge, nothing like that. But he's indirectly saying, none of this is removing my sorrow, but I know that you know what will remove my sorrow, so you please tell me that. And this is when we truly become seekers. When we are still looking for joys out in the world to remove our sorrows, we will be looking for a long time because we will never find it. But when we start coming to look for knowledge, look for the truth, look for that ultimate reality to remove our sorrow, then actually we become seekers. And actually our sorrow will be removed because we are then looking for the right thing. So this is another great thing about Arjuna. Now we continue, and Sanjaya now, he brings the whole dialogue together. And so we will see verse number 9. Sanjaya Uvacha
Sanjaya Uvacha
Evam Uktva Hrishikesham
Eva Muktva Rishikesham
Gudakeshah Parantapaha
Gudakesha Parantapaha
Nayotsya iti Govindam
Nayotsya iti Govindam
Uktva Tushnim Babhuvaha
Muktva Tushnim Babhuvaha
Sanjaya Uvacha Eva Muktva Hrishikesham Gudakeshah Parantapaha Nayotsya iti Govindam Uktva Tushnim Babhuvaha. So Sanjaya now comes and continues. Remember, Sanjaya is telling this to Dhritarashtra. So he says, Evam Uktva means having spoken thus, who Hrishikesham, to Hrishikesha, to Lord Krishna, who spoke Gudakesha Parantapa. Gudakesha, that Lord of sleep, conqueror of sleep, Parantapa, the scorcher of foes, Arjuna. What did he say? Nayotsya. He said, I'm not going to fight. He said, I'm just not going to fight. Iti Govindam. He said this to Lord Krishna, Govinda. Uktva. And having said that, Tushnim Babhuvaha. He became silent. So Sanjaya here comes and tells what happened. Now here, very beautifully, you see the names of Lord Krishna and Arjuna. Two names of Lord Krishna, Hrishikesha and Govinda. Hrishikesha means Lord of the senses. We saw that meaning before. Why are we using this name? Because remember, he said, my senses are dried up. Yet chokam uchoshanam indriyana. So you are the Lord of the senses, Hrishikesha. And Govindam, Gam, Vindati means Ga, Go means Veda. It can mean cow, it can mean Brahmana, it can also mean Veda. So the one who holds the Veda in their hand is Govinda. The one who protects the Veda, who has the Veda, is Govinda. And he's calling Bhagavan Krishna this way because the essence of the Veda is about to come out. And he calls Arjuna Gudakesha, the one who has conquered this Gudaka, that tamas, that sleep, that inertia, because Arjuna's coming out of his thinking, of his rut, of his wrong delusion, of his rut. He's coming out of it. And Parantapa, to remind everyone that Arjuna is actually Parantapa, is actually very strong. But Arjuna says, I'm not going to fight. And he becomes silent. So you see the stages that happened to Arjuna. First, he was standing tall with his conch and said, bring me to the middle where I can see everybody. Then after that, his Sidanti Mamagatrani, his lips were dried, his head is spinning, he's shaking. Then after that, at the end of chapter 1, he sits down and his Gandiva slips from his hand. And now he says, I'm just not going to fight. Means what? I'm not going to fight until Bhagavan Krishna, you tell me what to do. I'm not going to fight. And finally, Arjuna becomes quiet. He's just silent. So after all of his logical arguments in chapter 1, after again going through certain things in chapter 2, he becomes quiet. And when the student becomes quiet, the teachers love it. That's why that mute button is so great, right? The teachers love it because now the teaching can actually come. And so we come now to verse number 10. Tamuvacha Rishikeshaha
तमुवाच ऋषिकेशः
Prahasanniv Bharata
प्रहसन्निव भारत
Senayorubhayormadhye
सेनयोरुभयोर्मध्ये
Vishidantamidam vachaha
विषीदन्तमिदं वचः
Tamuvacha Rishikeshaha Prahasanniv Bharata Senayorubhayormadhye Vishidantamidam vachaha. So now that Arjuna was quiet, what happened? Tam uvacha, to him spoke Hrishikesha, that Bhagavan Krishna, the Lord of the senses, Prahasan iva, as though he's smiling. Bharata, this Bharata is Dhritarashtra. Oh Dhritarashtra, his name is Bharata. Then spoke Bhagavan Krishna, and as though smiling. And where did he speak? Senayorubhayor madhye, in the middle of both armies. And who did he speak to? Vishidanta. He spoke to Arjuna, who was despondent, was grieving. And what did he speak? Idam vachaha, these words. So finally, we see, Arjuna there is a contrast here. Arjuna is grieving. Vishidantam, he's grieving, he's broken down, he doesn't know what to do. He's going through so much in his mind. Bhagavan Krishna is smiling, as though smiling. So there's a huge contrast here. And why is Bhagavan Krishna smiling? So many things are said because of this. Number one, he's smiling, as though smiling, because finally now he has a chance to speak. He must have wanted to say so many things to Arjuna before, but he could not, right? And a wise person never gives advice when the other person keeps letting out and talking and talking and talking, because they won't listen. So finally, Bhagavan Krishna says, now I have time. I have a chance to speak. I've been wanting to speak for so long. And Bhagavan Krishna is smiling because he says, now I can give this teaching to the world. I can give this teaching which is lodged in my heart, which is going to benefit the whole world. I want to give it out, and I've been waiting for the right moment. And he's smiling because this teaching is not like in the Upanishads, how we see that everything is in the Guru and Shishya ashrama, it's in nature, it's so quiet, it's silent. This is the middle of the battlefield. So this is a teaching unlike any other teaching. It's going to be so practical, so dynamic, and so much meant for those in the world today. And so Bhagavan Krishna smiles. And Bhagavan Krishna also smiles because that which is so heavy, so heavy on Arjuna's head is as light as a feather on Bhagavan Krishna's shoulder, because he has that wisdom. So what is a situation? How heavy is it? It depends on how we look at it. When we're in the state of Arjuna, despondent and grieving and confused and deluded, it will be so heavy on our head that we will break down. But when we have this wisdom, like Lord Krishna, then it will be light as a feather. And that's why he smiles. And he calmly speaks. What does he say? Now, before we look at what he says, we are going to take a brief look at the commentary by Adi Shankaracharya ji. Puja Gurudev Swami Chinmayananda ji has written this commentary based on Adi Shankaracharyaji's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. And Adi Shankaracharyaji, he does not write any commentary until the introduction to verse 2.11. So, and he writes a very beautiful one. We will just see a glimpse of it so we can understand where Lord Krishna is coming from in verse 2.11. Because Lord Krishna comes from the highest standpoint. So I will read some parts of it and I will explain, and then we will go forward to look at it. So he says, this is what's happening. He kind of, backtracks for us. He says, look, here from chapter 1, where it says, Drishtva tu Pandavanika, where it said, look at the Pandavas, to Nayotsya iti Govindam, to this verse that we just saw, 2.10, what is being seen here? He says, iti etadantaha praninam shokam mohadi samsara bija bhuta doshodbhava karana pradarshanaarthatvena. Lavite. He says, in this whole thing, in all of these verses, which started from chapter 1 to 2.10, all that it's trying to show us is that samsara is caused by two things, shoka and moha. Shoka means sorrow, moha means delusion. This is what Arjuna had, and this is the bija, this is the seed of samsara. And he says, this is what we're going to talk about in Bhagavad Gita, how to remove this, which is the seed of samsara. And he says, how does this come? How does this delusion, how does this grief come? Tathahi Arjunena Raja Guru Putra Mitra Suhrid Swajana Sambandhi Bandhaveshu. In his relatives, in his guru, in his nephews, nieces, friends, all his relatives, he had this feeling. What is the feeling? Aham esham mama ete. This is what really caused that grief and delusion. Aham esham, I belong to them, and mama ete, they are mine. This is the thought that's really causing that. This is why he's confused. He's confused because he's saying, I belong to them and they are mine. They are my gurus. They are my people. And this is why he's so sad. He says, how can I kill those people? It is because of this word, I, mine. Just look at our lives today. Just look at our lives today. How many people must have passed away due to COVID in the United States? I think now it's over 500,000, right? Do we feel that sorrow? Do we feel this? So many people are dying every day. Every day, so many people are dying all over the world. Do we feel sorrow? We don't feel sorrow unless it's someone very close to us, unless it's someone who we hold near and dear. So what is the grief? What is the source of that grief? The source of that grief is not death. The source of the grief is our attachment to that particular situation. When we say my blank passed away, there is grief. When we say blank passed away, there is no grief. It is just one word. But in that one word, so much identification comes out. So many pets get lost every day. So many. But if it is my pet, then I will feel that grief. So here what's happening is Adi Shankaracharya says, death is not the problem. War is not the problem. What the problem is here is that I, that is a problem. And therefore, that is what we need to work on. And he goes on and he says further that this shoka mohabhyam hi abhibhuta viveka vijnana. When we have such grief and such delusion, our viveka vijnana, our knowledge gets overpowered. It gets overpowered. And we saw this. And he says, Swata eva kshatra dharme yuddhe pravrittaha api. Tasmat yuddhat upararama. He went to the war field as a kshatriya, ready to fight. But now he wants to run away. And not only does he want to run away, paradharmam cha bhiksha jivanadikam kartum pravavritte. He wants to do paradharma. He wants to become a bhikshu. And it's all because of this shoka and moha. And so he says, because of that, for all beings, tatha cha sarva praninam shoka mohadi dosha avishta chetasam swabhavataha eva swadharma parityagaha pratishiddha seva cha syat. When people are deluded over this, then they just let go of their dharma. They don't do it. And so he says the seed really of this whole thing is that shoka and moha. And therefore, because the seed of samsara is grief and delusion, and it's caused by wrong thinking, what is the solution? Right thinking and right knowledge. And that's why Sankhya means right knowledge. It means knowledge of the self. This chapter is called Sankhya Yoga. It means knowledge of the self. That is what's going to happen in chapter 2. That is what's going to happen from here on. And that is the standpoint that Bhagavan Krishna is going to come from, because he doesn't want to alleviate the problem by like Tylenol or Motrin or whatever. He doesn't want to give you a temporary relief. He wants to nip it from the bud. So he's going to tell Arjuna, you're deluded about who you are. And because you're deluded about who you are, everything else is unclear. Only when we have clarity about who we are, then we have clarity about our relationship with the world. So now that we know where Lord Krishna is coming from, why he's doing this, let us just review briefly what exactly does Vedanta say about who we are. If we understand this, we are going to just take a brief look at Puja Gurudev's BMI chart. I know many of you have already looked at that. Many of you do know it. We're going to just take a brief look at it. And if this is very clear, then the verses that are to come from Lord Krishna, they're going to be very clear. So let's just focus first on this groundwork, and then we can move forward. So I will share my screen with you so that you can see. Now, for those of you who have not seen this before, this is what we call the BMI chart. BMI, body, mind, intellect. And this was coined by Puja Gurudev Swami Chinmayananda. And this chart tells us exactly what our identity is. And I will start by just giving us a glimpse and explaining to us. We have, all of us, 3 able instruments. We have 3 able instruments with which we experience and with which we live our lives. These instruments are called the body, the mind, and the intellect. Therefore, they are here. So these are equipments, these are faculties, these are instruments. What is this body? This body is this gross manifest thing that you see here. It consists of different parts. It's something you can see, it's something you can touch, something you can smell. This is called your body, my body. And we all know that the body is made up of food. It's made up of food, which comes from the 5 elements. So therefore, the more we eat, the bigger we get. The less we eat, the smaller we get. Is it because it's made out of food? This is one equipment that we have. Another equipment that we have is what we call the mind. Now, the mind is subtle. It's not something we can see. Is it the brain? It's not the brain. We cannot see it. We cannot measure it. It's subtle, but it is a flow of thoughts. What kind of thoughts? So we know thoughts that are of emotional nature, thoughts that are sometimes doubting, thoughts that are going here and there. Those thoughts are what we call the mind. They make up the mind. Then we have the intellect. Intellect is also thoughts, but they're more determined thoughts. They're more, what we call nishchayatmika buddhi. This is what we're going to do, and this is it. The mind tends to be like this. Sankalpa vikalpa. It tends to flow from here and there, but the intellect is very determined. And so the thoughts of the mind nature may graduate to become the intellect. Thoughts of the intellect nature can graduate to become the mind, or we should say go towards becoming mind. These are our instruments. These are our instruments with which we interact with the world. Now, what do these instruments do? Very simple. This body, it perceives objects, right? So it's a gross body. And with this gross body, we can perceive all kinds of different objects. We can grasp, we can see, we can eat, we can hold, we can go places. So this body perceives objects. What does the mind do? The mind is an instrument which feels emotions. It feels different kinds of emotions that come through. What does the intellect do? The intellect thinks thoughts. It thinks different kinds of thoughts, various kinds of thoughts, ideas, things that we could never imagine, imagination, ideas, goals, ideologies. Intellect thinks in these terms. Mind is mostly emotional nature, feelings, different rasas. This is how the mind thinks. Now, how do our instruments act? In what direction do they go? Why do they do the things they do? Why they do the things they do is because of our vasanas, which is V over here. Vasanas means our past impressions, our past habits, our past notions, our past tendencies. They determine why the body perceives certain objects, why the mind feels certain emotions, why the intellect thinks certain thoughts. Our vasanas are really what color these instruments or push them forth to go in a certain direction. So our vasanas, and at the same time, what we experience in the world. Now, an important question comes as, can these act on their own? Can the body, the mind, the intellect, can they act on their own? Can they do things on their own? No. They are what we call inert. The body is definitely inert because it cannot know me. My hand cannot know me, isn't it? Cannot know me. My mind is also inert, right? My thoughts cannot know me. I may be aware of my thoughts, but my thoughts cannot know me, nor can my intellectual thoughts know me. So they are inert. They cannot function on their own. They are instruments, but they cannot function on their own. So what is it that lends life to all of our instruments? This is what we call Om. This Om is that principle which we call consciousness, we call awareness. That is Om. And that Om is in whose presence everything functions. It doesn't do anything. It's just a presence. It's a changeless awareness. It's a presence. And in that presence, everything happens. The body perceives objects, the mind feels emotions, the intellect thinks thoughts. Everything happens in that presence of Om. So if life were like this, it's very simple. The body, mind, intellect will do what they have to do. And we know that this is our true nature. This is who we are. This is Om. But what happens is we forget that this is our nature. We forget that we are that witness, that observer, that changeless awareness. We forget that that's our nature. And we begin to think that we are this limited body. We begin to think that we're the mind and we're the intellect. We start to identify with these limitations called the body, mind, and intellect. And when we start to identify with that, we become this ego. When we identify with the body, we're called perceiver. We become the perceiver. When we identify with the mind, we are called feeler. When we identify with the intellect, we are called thinker. And so this PFT, perceiver, feeler, thinker, is what we call ego. This is what we call ego. This is what we call jiva. This is what we call soul. Many times there's this word soul. So soul can actually also mean jiva or ego. This is what we call self. So this perceiver, feeler, thinker, jiva, individuality, soul, all it is, it's a wrong notion. It's a wrong notion. It's us thinking that we're something that we're not. It's us thinking that we are this limited body, mind, intellect, when we're not it. It is a wrong notion. The right notion is that we are this self. We are this limitless, changeless, awareness, infinite, blissful self. That is the right notion. Being the limited ego is the wrong notion. That self is changeless. It doesn't change. Nothing happens to it. And that's how we know it's real and it's true. This ego keeps changing because every part of it changes. Our body changes, our mind changes, our intellect changes. And so obviously, when we identify with the changing, we are also changing because it keeps changing. So this is always changing. This is a wrong notion. Identifying with this, we will really suffer. But knowing that we are this, we will not suffer. This is the standpoint that Bhagavan Krishna is going to be teaching from. He will first start from the highest standpoint, saying, "O Arjuna, there is nothing for you to grieve because don't you know who you are?" And that's how he will start this message. So we will just read the message little bit, what Lord Krishna is going to say. We will just do a slight intro and then more on it we will take up when we see each other next time. This is verse 2.11. So this is another very, very important verse. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha.
Shri Bhagavan Uvacha.
Ashochananvashocastvam.
Ashochananvashocastvam.
Prajnavaadanscha bhashase.
Prajnavaadanscha bhashase.
Gatasunagatasungscha
गतासूनगतासूंश्च
Nanushocanti panditaha.
नानुशोचन्ति पण्डिताः
Shri Bhagavanuvacha Ashochanan Vashochastvam Prajnavadanscha Bhashase Gatasuna Nanushocanti Panditaha. What is Bhagavan Krishna's first teaching to Arjuna? He says, Ashochan anvashochastvam. He says, Tvam, you Arjuna, anvashochaha, you've grieved. You've grieved over whom? Ashochan, over those who should not be grieved for. You are grieving. And prajna vadanscha bhashase, you speak as though you're speaking words of wisdom. That whole exposition you gave in chapter 1, as though you're speaking such high Vedanta, such wisdom. But in truth, gatasun means those who have already gone, and agatasunscha, and those who are going. Living means they're going. Na anushochanti panditaha. The wise do not grieve for those who have gone and for those who are going. And this is Bhagavan Krishna's first answer to Arjuna. Very beautiful. Now, what that means, where is he coming from? That we will take up, not next week, because we have Hanuman Jayanti, but the week after. Okay? So, those of you who are not so familiar with the BMI chart, please read Gurudev's introduction to the Bhagavad Gita and familiarize yourself with it, because once you're more familiar with it, it will be very easy to understand the next verses. What did we see today? We saw Arjuna's surrender is out of strength. It's out of strength to know our limitations, to know that this is all we know, this is all we can do, but with your help, we can do better. That comes from strength. And Arjuna also realizes that these seeming joys of having a kingdom, of having so much power, are really not going to remove my sorrow. And so Arjuna finally keeps quiet. He says, I'm not going to fight, pretty much, Lord Krishna, until you tell me what to do. And he's quiet. This is the moment when Lord Krishna smiles, because he is so excited and he's waiting to give us the message of that beautiful Bhagavad Gita. And what does this message of the Gita contain? It tells us that the seed of samsara is shoka and moha. It's grief and delusion. And this comes from wrong thinking, thinking that they are mine, I am theirs. And this wrong thinking stems from wrong notion of who we are. And so therefore, the Bhagavad Gita gives us the right notion about who we are, thereby removing that delusion and removing that grief. Okay? All right. So Gurudev's introduction is in that very same Bhagavad Gita that you have. You can take a look at that and read it. Okay? So I will say the closing prayer now, and then I will make an announcement about Hanuman Jayanti, and then those who have questions can stay back. Okay? Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om.